You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Today, we'll be talking about sustainability, finding the inspiration that we need to create positive behaviors, whether that's in our yoga practice, in our teaching, or really in any aspect of our lives, and how we can keep that going over the long term. So I'm here today with Tiffany Cruikshank. So I thought we'd get started by talking first about yoga practice, because I think most of the people who are associated with yoga medicine are into yoga practice. So you've been practicing for decades, as have I. Did that just make you feel old then?
I was like, how long? I always have to think.
We can say years. Maybe that sounds
I like
more
decades.
delicate
It's
than
easy.
decades. So what keeps you going back to your yoga mat? What keeps you going back to the practice despite all of the other sort of disruptions and distractions of life?
That's a great question. For me, I think the biggest thing is just the layers. There's so many different layers and nuances. You can really focus on the physical layers of the body. And even that can be so broad and diverse, the ways you're looking. I mean, you can look at, old school orthopedics or more of a physical therapy kind of lens. You can also look through a fascial lens. You could look through, you can focus on so many different things. And it's just one tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of the yoga practice. And yet, the cool thing I think about the physical practices is that we can all connect to that. We all have that shared experience of sensations and awareness in the body. But then there's all this other stuff. There's the mind and the physiology. There's the energetics and the traditional practices, and then the more modern interpretations of practice. And I just think there's so many layers to investigate and indulge in. It's like you could go into one rabbit hole and just spend your whole life studying that.
So do you find that your practice varies quite a lot then, depending on what's intriguing you on the day?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of us, I'm sure you do this too. I think we all kind of have tendencies and maybe things that we really like or lean to, but um, for me, it is really different based on the day. I mean, I know in COVID, a lot of us find ourselves sitting a lot, and myself included. And so for me, I think a lot recently, movement has been a big part of my practice and something I often crave and want when I get to my mat. But I think it also just takes a moment of me kind of tuning in, like, what do I need? Not what do I think I need, right?
What do
I
I
think we all
actually
do
need?
that. Like, oh, I need to do this or I need to do that, or this quota that we have to fulfill of some sort. But like, what do I need? Can I feel into? Right. Because sometimes we even get so up in our head about it. And those
Yeah.
people who have done a lot of trainings with us, like, it's really easy to overthink it, right? And be
Yeah,
so in your
totally.
head about it. Like, what do I need? Oh no, like, what do I actually need? And then, as humans, we look in the email box or the newspaper or whatever you read nowadays, and every day you wake up and there's like 5 more things you have to do for this, 5 more things
Mm.
for your hamstrings, 5 more things anti-aging, 5 more things for your digestion, 5 more things to prevent burnout. And I think those are wonderful that we have these resources online now, but it can also be really overwhelming. And then
Yeah.
you're like, what do I do?
Yeah. So for you, it's about sort of arriving somewhere that's quiet enough that you can ask yourself and answer honestly, what do I actually need? What do I really need today?
Yeah, and I think even just pausing and taking a moment to tune in, it doesn't even need to be anything formal, at least for
Mm.
me. And I think a lot of people find themselves, thumbing through hundreds or thousands of classes online trying to find that right one. And it's why, it's part of the reason why we created those weekly lineups so that, and I often use this. I don't know about you, but for me,
Totally.
like that's my first go-to is I look at the YMO weekly lineup. And then if any of those kind of fit something
Hmm.
that I'm needing, which, there's a nice variety of different practices, um, then I'm usually going there because otherwise you can, I mean, all
You
practices feel
could be
good to some
looking
extent.
forever. Hmm.
Yeah, and most of us don't have a lot of time.
Yeah. And even if you don't see exactly what you're looking for, at least that helps clarify in your mind what you are looking for. I know it needs to be shorter or it needs to be more active, or no, I want to focus on shoulders. So it
Yeah.
does kind of send you down a direction that perhaps you didn't have to start with.
Yeah, and
What?
I actually really like it's I almost welcome it as a challenge when I used to go to in-person classes too, and I try and do this when I practice online as well, is to sometimes just pick one. I mean,
Mm,
obviously there you're going to want vinyasa or yin or you have some basic preferences, but then I think it's kind of a challenge to find what I need within a class because sometimes it's just my ability to really drop in, my ability to really
mm,
trust in what the instructor is providing. And obviously, it's not going to be, individualized to your specific needs. But I think, as we start to adjust, I'm tired today. So I'm maybe not putting as much energy in. Maybe I'm conserving my energy or I'm focusing on my breath or really kind of drawing my attention inward rather than, really expending all of this energy vigorously moving. I think even in a vigorous class, there is ways to conserve our energy just on the quality of movement and our mental focus too, I think is a big thing. So I kind of like having that challenge of like, can I find what I need in this practice?
yeah. I
Like
actually find that a lot easier online. For me, that kind of takes the pressure off of setting any kind of good example because I'm alone in my own space, and if that means going slower or if that means stopping or if that means adding something in, for some reason that's easier for me online than
mm,
it is in an in-person space where I feel some responsibility to the teacher. I should be doing what they say as a sort of
yeah.
gesture of support for them.
You're like me. You're like want to please the teacher, right? There's this weird kind of battle between I'm here to get what I need. It is,
Hmm.
it's there for self-care, but there's also this like need to please the teacher. I can do what
Or even
everyone's
just
doing.
respect. I know how
Yeah.
hard it is to plan a class and to pull it all together and to get
Uh,
there. So just as a gesture of respect, I should, at least 80% of the time.
as a teacher, you're always like, well, that person you see someone doing something totally different,
Mm,
which it's hard not to think, well,
I
what
wonder if I should have.
is this not good enough? Like
Mm, yeah.
I
For
mean, you
me, it
can't
kind
go
of
down that rabbit hole,
varies.
but
If there's a sort of subset of they're doing a similar thing to what I'm suggesting, but it's dialed down or it's dialed up versus it's Shavasana and they're doing a headstand where I
yeah.
might think, did I not peak high enough? Did I not give them enough of what they needed?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a lot behind all of that, but yeah, I always just assume that, they're taking what they need, but
Mm,
there's always like, well, it'd be nice if we could there is that feeling, when you have a class and everyone's really in it together.
mhm.
There's just that vibe, when
Yeah,
everything clicks. And I mean, maybe it's how people are showing up on their mats, maybe it's how I'm guiding the practice. That's just what it is. There's just those
the
moments. Maybe the
magical
stars
moments.
are aligning. Who knows? Who
So
knows?
going back to your personal practice, has it changed much through the years?
Mm, you know the answer to this.
I'm guessing it's yes from the pictures I've seen from
You
the
know,
early days. I'm guessing it's yes.
from the early days, that's really funny because I was actually just thinking about when I used to teach at this yoga studio called Yoga Boga. Um, this man, Bill Counter, he used to take all these photos, and there are pictures of me. I was trying to find them the other day, and I couldn't even find them online anymore. But like doing ridiculous, crazy poses um, from third and fourth series, and yeah, I couldn't find them, and it was so important to me. It felt so, you felt so accomplished. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. and do this thing that no one even knew about, which I really loved.
Mm,
That it was like, the superhero behind closed doors, that no one ever saw, which was funny because it's not like anyone really benefited from that. I mean, yes and no, right? Of course, I think it really served its purpose. And when we're younger, I do think there is this role of discipline that the practice does teach us. I mean, you see this in my experience in India. You see this now. The main place, and I think it's changed a little bit more recently, but you know, the main place you see yoga in India is really in schools, and even there, you don't
Mm.
see it a lot. I remember what years? I think it was 2008 or 9. We took a teacher training there for the first time, and we went down to where Gandhi's ashes are and practiced there. And everyone was staring and taking photos. It was like we stood out like a sore thumb.
You were the
And
tourist attraction.
yeah, and all the teachers were so confused, because this is the birthplace of yoga.
Mhm.
But you and I don't know, I think things are changing there maybe a little bit now, but you know, back then it was like, and when I started going there in 2003, it was there wasn't much yoga there, even in the schools. But when you did see it, it was usually kids doing it in school. And now I know
Mm.
when we go to visit our nonprofit there, the kids do yoga, and it's really sweet. Everyone is coming into the pose and they're counting 1 2 3, and then on 4 they all come down, and they look really proud of themselves. They have the smile on their face, and then it's all right, now 1 2. They're calling out the poses and counting, and it's very precise and disciplined, and they're very proud of
Very Ashtanga.
themselves.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's sweet because I do think there is something that discipline fulfills in
Mm.
our lives. It may not be the style of yoga that we're familiar with
Mm.
or is known to us, but I do think, for me in my 20s, maybe that was more of the role that it fulfilled for me. And the challenge, if I wasn't, and I always say this, I used to say this a lot, if I wasn't doing that in yoga, I probably would have been doing it in a sport or something else. It
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
the time of my life, that period of my life. And I loved being able to challenge myself and push those borders. There was a point where maybe it wasn't very helpful, but for a long
Yeah.
time, I think it was great. So it's definitely changed a lot. And I think for me as a practitioner and as a teacher, I'm more worried when someone's practice doesn't change over the years,
Mm.
especially if you've been practicing for decades. I have met some people in my time doing yoga who practice the same thing for decades and
Mm.
decades, which, if it works for you, great. But I can't imagine, my body
You think how
changes.
much you've changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Body and mind.
And even
How could you need the same things? It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and even if you're healthy, like, your body's still changing. It doesn't
Mm.
necessarily mean that it's changing negatively in an awful
No.
way as we age. I mean, there are things changing.
Totally. Yeah. I'm actually really glad that I didn't find a more vigorous practice style when I was younger because I suspect I could have done myself some serious harm because I was very similar to you looking for that sort of discipline, but I found it at the gym. So,
Mm,
high impact aerobics, wrist weights, ankle weights, G strings, short shorts, puffy white socks, all the good things. And yoga for me thankfully was the opposite. It was the break from the gym, it was the break from wanting to get
mm,
straight A's at school, and it was the place where nothing was expected of me. And I don't know if I'd still be practicing now if it had served a different place in my life because it sort of became the really comfortable thing to come back to as opposed to I'm not still doing high impact aerobics, put it that way. So
yeah.
that side of my life has very much changed.
Well, and I do agree with that. I know when I first started practicing when I was 14, I mean, I struggled so much as a teenager. I was teased so much and bullied, and like I just never felt like I fit in. And I know a
Mm.
lot of other people, I mean, it's kind of what most people, I think a lot of people I assume experience as teenagers.
Mm.
And for me, that yoga practice, there was just something about it that felt
Mhm.
like I could be at peace in my body for a moment. I
Yeah.
could feel comfortable in my skin for a moment. And, I didn't know it at the time, but I do think that that was a really important role because at the time I was very athletic and competitive and a few different things. And, you know, it, yoga was different. It was
Mm.
physical and I needed that. I liked that, but it was more. And I didn't know. I didn't need to know. It was just it. And I think that's what you're saying as well.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It was the only place in my life where my brain and my body inhabited the same place at the same time. Because at
Mm,
school, I was in my brain, and at the gym, I was in my body, but I didn't have many places or really any places where the two crossed over. And I was a very vague kid. I would always have my nose in a book, not very common sense, practical, real world. And I think that was because of that separation. The brain was doing this, the body was
mm.
doing that, and yoga was really my chance to bring the two together. And I remember that feeling so different. If I hadn't had that experience, I don't know that it would be something I'd be still coming back to 30 odd, 35 odd years later.
Mm. I love that. I think there were some good
Oh.
quotes in there.
So
Rachel quotes.
early days of your practice, there was some physical intensity and the discipline of it really appealed to you. And
Mhm.
then what does it kind of look like now? Or what does it feel like now?
Well, I think it's kind of what we were saying before. It's kind of what I need that day, which some
Mm,
days is really vigorous
mm,
and then some days is inversions
mm.
and some of that, what people think of as the fancy stuff. For me, it's just kind of about getting upside down,
Yeah.
and shifting blood flow and lymphatics and all of that. And some days it's just really simple, like the
Mm.
meat and potatoes, the really simple stuff or the kale and broccoli. And like the really simple things that we know, I think
Mm.
I think it's one of those things right now. We have so much at our fingertips, which is wonderful. We're learning so much about yoga, but it's easy to overlook some of those the simple stuff. And so sometimes
Yeah.
it is just moving and breathing and being in my body, which I think is a lot
Mm.
of the potency of our practice. Some days it's being still, you know, restoring. It really just depends. And I think it requires that baseline, we talk about in yoga is that truthfulness, our ability
Mm.
to be truthful and nonviolent and content and all of the, the basics of our yoga practice. So that inquiry.
Well, here's a question then. Have you ever had a period of your life when physical practice, asana practice, has been absent, where there's been sort of no desire to go to your mat?
Well, there's definitely ups and downs for sure.
Mm.
And I know when I had a really big injury. It's been a dozen years ago now. It's been a long time, but I was doing a lot of Ashtanga. I had just completed fourth series. I was so proud of myself. And
I
I
can't even
remember
imagine.
I remember it specifically. I was in the shower. It was in my source practice. I think I'd just gotten done practicing and then teaching. And it was all still only like 8 a.m. at this point. And I remember being in the shower and leaning over to get the soap and the feeling in my back, like, it was like the whole world just stopped. Um, Anyways, I herniated my disc, obviously not from picking up the soap. It's a lot longer story, and, yeah, gosh, I've thought about it so many times. What was it? Was it all the Ashtanga? Was it standing hunched over my acupuncture patients all day long after doing a full Ashtanga practice at 4 a.m. every morning? Was it, something biomechanically? Was it, did I not have enough leg strength?
It's always an accumulation though, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
never just one thing.
Yeah. And so it was a lot of different things, but what was really beautiful about it, it was challenging at the time. And I will say I at the beginning really pushed through a lot. At the
Mm.
time I was traveling and teaching a lot of inversion workshops and arm balancing workshops. And, I could take an Advil and feel okay and do all these things that I wanted to do. And then obviously pay for it a little bit later. And finally, it was like, what are you doing, Tiffany? And then
Mm.
sit on a plane for 12 hours, right? Which
Oh.
in coach, I had this thing, I would always fall asleep curled up. That was like my way I could sleep. But Eventually it was like a big kick in the pants. I couldn't do
Mm,
that very long. You can only do that for so long. And then it was great because, I had this sports medicine practice where I was working with all of my patients there, some of which were yoga students and some were not. And I was teaching both vinyasa and ashtanga at the time. And when this happened, it was like it just forced me to start really integrating what I knew and loved about sports medicine
hmm.
into my
Taking your own
vinyasa.
advice.
Yeah, well, into the vinyasa practices because I don't know if other people were thinking this way, but I wasn't thinking this way at the time. It was like, here's the poses and this is how you do them and you do them this way.
Mm,
And, here's the sequencing model you have to use. And this is, this is what you're supposed to do in air quotes. And,
mm.
for me, it was kind of lifting those restrictions and
Huh.
combining my background in, sports medicine and anatomy and physiology and work with my own patients with bleeding that into the yoga practice and overlapping them and experimenting um, and I'm really grateful for it because if I hadn't had that intense of an injury, I don't
Yeah.
think I ever, I would have kept going as
Yeah.
business as usual.
You wouldn't have had that inspiration to sort of shift
Yeah,
perspectives or directions. Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting that you say that. I guess I had teachers early on, and then the bulk of my practice after that was just by myself. And so I
Mm,
didn't have very good awareness of what I was supposed to be doing or what the shapes were supposed to look like. And I think in many ways that was quite
yeah.
freeing. I was probably like, it probably looked awful from the outside, but I wasn't, I didn't take pictures then. I didn't know that was a thing. So I think I had like a good 15 years, I'd say, of not knowing anything about how it should look or how things should be sequenced together, just kind of trusting my gut. And it wasn't until I got to teacher training that I suddenly found out that I'd been doing all of these things, wrong in inverted commas, and then found all that structure and then have sort of been softening a lot of that structure since. So for me, that was much less entrenched, which maybe was a good thing considering that I'm a pretty linear person. So maybe it was
Mm,
better that I didn't have those constraints early
yeah,
on. Hmm.
I love
I
that.
might have been a bit of a sort of yoga, you know, thou
You might
shalt.
be very different now.
Probably.
Well, and I think I kind of went around in a circle there, but my point with that too was that during that period, I really did have to shift my practice quite a bit.
Mm,
And with a herniated disc, I mean, there's a spectrum obviously of presentations. Mine was pretty significant.
mm,
Um, I had a lot of neurologic symptoms associated with it, and so I really did have to back off. And I started incorporating a bit more strength training, which was helpful because I felt like I could more easily control those movements. They were a little
mm,
more straightforward and robotic, for lack of better words,
mm,
predictable. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for there, but and it felt helpful for me, which I think was partly because I was very flexible. I was the person that could do a lot of the flexibility stuff pretty easily, minus the back bends. Those were never easy
mm.
for me, but
I mean,
hips.
when I see pictures, though, obviously you were strong. There were a lot of poses there that didn't just require you flopping
Mm.
around. The inversion side of things requires a significant amount of strength. So, do you think it was the simplicity of the strength training movements, where one plane, less complexity,
I
more
think it was a
clarity?
lot of lower body strength
Yeah.
because
Okay.
in Ashtanga I didn't get a lot of lower. I'm sure there are people now who are brilliant and do Ashtanga much differently. I'm sure.
Mm,
And I know there's a lot of variances on it now. People have different spins on it, but for me, for a lot of people, I think it lacks in the lower body strength because it is a lot of upper body strength. And I was
mm,
very strong in the upper body. I mean, that was great. Um, except once you start doing third series, you're doing all these arm balances, and then you actually start losing a little bit of your range of motion. I know everyone complains about that in Ashtanga, like, oh no, I'm losing my range of motion. Now I look back and I'm like, that was probably somewhat helpful, although you're not developing the lower body strength. And for me, I started integrating a lot of that into my yoga practice too, as well.
mm,
But yeah, I mean, there are definitely times when where we feel uninspired. And it is, I think everyone benefits from just stepping away. When it becomes
Mm,
a chore, it's hard to
yes.
be inspired by it.
That's what was lurking around in the back of my mind. I think for me, the reason that I'm still practicing after 35 ish years is it's never been something that I have to do. If I don't want to, I don't. If I want to spend the time outside, I do. If I want my
Mm,
practice to be 5 minutes, it is. For me, it's really important that my practice is a space that isn't imposed externally. And there's
mhm.
nothing wrong with discipline. There are plenty of areas of my life where there is discipline, but I have a tendency to go too far in that direction. And it's really important for me that my practice is spacious. And if that means no practice, that's fine
Well,
for
I
me.
agree too, and I think I follow a lot of that same mindset now, and I think when you do it only when you really wanna do it, you actually end up doing it a lot. Because
Yeah.
I do that to myself a lot too. It's like, okay, well, I'm gonna do what I and that's just kind of what I was saying before too. When I'm doing what I feel like is good for me, it should
Mhm,
also align, at least my idea of this in Chinese medicine too, is it should also align with something that's enjoyable,
mhm.
not that's torture. And so, I'm finding something that feels helpful, but also, you know, it seems like the right thing to do for whatever period of, I don't know, my cycle or the week or,
Yeah.
what my energy level is. But I think when you drop that need to practice,
Mhm.
it's true. You just I end up practicing most days. I am still a big fan of taking a day a week off. And I don't get upset with myself if I miss another day, or, if there's a period where I'm just like, I need to push back, take a week
Mm,
off and go for some runs, go to the gym. And, I do think for me as a yoga teacher, I learn other things about the body. I really love, I love going to the gym. We don't have a gym membership anymore, but we have a little home gym now. And I used to always go, when I'd go to the gym, I was always that person
a
doing
weirdo.
weird stuff. People would be looking at me like, what is she doing? But I would just play, knowing the
Mm,
anatomy, and the movements of the body are so intriguing to me, and being able to challenge that as we learn more about fascia or movements, it's interesting to me. And so I
mm.
like playing at the gym. I can't say I'm like someone who's consistent and goes for like
That
specific
is
strength
practice
gains.
though, really. That's your practice there of showing up with curiosity and kind of what happens if I and what do I feel if I. That to
Mm.
me is still very yogic, even though there might not be a yoga mat involved.
I think curiosity is
Mm,
probably the greatest tool for sustainability, because
for sure.
you can't teach curiosity. As a teacher,
Hmm.
if you're not curious, or in any profession, if you're not curious, I mean, obviously there are a lot of reasons to have a job. Sometimes a job is a means to an end, and I think that's a viable thing.
Hmm.
But that curiosity really is what keeps us intrigued and interested and engaged. And when it comes from that place, I think it's a lot more authentic. It's this real desire to share. And I really believe that every person in this world has something to share in some way. And that
Hmm.
might mean 10 career path changes over the course of our lifetime. It may mean you teach yoga or you don't. But for me, it's about that dedication to contributing to my community in some way, whether that's teaching yoga or whether that's teaching school or whether that's, whatever, whatever that might
No,
be.
I totally agree. And then we're kind of segueing from practicing into teaching. Uh, and I mean, for me personally, I've had a lot of jobs. I think I counted 26 jobs before I got to be a yoga teacher. But my real job, my qualification was in marketing. And I worked for, I think, 6 years or 7 years in big corporate marketing. And, I learned a lot of really important skills, many of which I use now. But the thing that I remember the most vividly was the feeling that it wasn't going anywhere, not career wise, just it wasn't helping anyone. It wasn't doing anything real. I kept thinking if I time traveled back to the Stone Age and tried to explain what I did, nobody would be able to wrap their heads around what does it mean to explain to people that they need this program on their phone. So underneath it all, there was this sort of undermining of all the effort and energy that I was putting in because it didn't feel like it was doing anything meaningful for anyone. And I think that's been the single biggest change in terms of what inspires me to teach is I constantly get this reaffirmation of this is real world, real life helpful for somebody. Somebody feels better today and they're going to smile when they leave this practice. They're going to be more patient when they're driving. They're going to be kinder to their family. That sort of ripple out effect constantly reaffirms the energy and the effort that it takes to teach for me.
I love that. And I think there's this illusion of there like being a perfect job too, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who do marketing who feel that way, right?
Oh,
The trick is
totally.
finding that thing that feels
Yes.
that way to you. And so,
For you.
we have teachers coming in all the time, and the one thing that I can't teach people is that curiosity,
Mm,
which makes me really excited because a lot of the people who come in are very curious, as you've seen. A lot of the people in our trainings, there's lots of really
mm,
great ideas and questions and, um, new ways of thinking about things. And so I think that curiosity is important. The curiosity is something that you can't teach, but but it can also take you down a lot of rabbit holes, right? So and
there's pros and cons to that spaciousness, isn't there?
yeah, and I mean, I
Yeah.
struggle with this in teacher trainings too, like, because I love the curiosity and I love the
Mhm,
questions, and I have to also be careful not to go down all these rabbit holes, but really to choose to focus on the ones that really relate back to real issues in a yoga teaching setting, because it's
mm,
all interesting. The body, like, I do this myself. I'll start learning or studying something or reading something or listening to something, and then I'm like, I want to learn more. And I
mhm,
have to keep focusing on the purpose. My purpose is helping people with yoga, with the tools of yoga, and be able to keep coming back to that, which is so important. And then also, I think the curiosity is what sparks that desire to keep learning. And I really
mm,
believe um, sustainability is really built on that continued investment in my own learning. And
mm.
within that, the hard part is I have to keep learning, but the problem is the more you start to learn, the more you realize you don't
Yeah.
know.
You
It's
start
like
unraveling the ball of yarn.
the scariest is like, when you have someone who doesn't have that, right? Who like thinks they have all the answers.
Yeah,
That's when we want to be worried, because
yeah.
and this is the challenging thing as a teacher, because we start to learn more, but then we start to realize how much we don't know. And so I think a big part of this is, one, the commitment to continuing to learn, but being open to it being a work in progress,
And
because
maybe that itself is what keeps you teaching for decades because you're never done. You're never
mm,
finished. There's always those avenues that you didn't get to explore that you'd like to explore or new aspects of the practice that have opened up for you that you weren't aware of 5 years ago.
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I could dive down a million different rabbit holes. I have to like shut the book, cut
Rein it
yourself off,
back.
Tiffany, like close the web browser, like you got to get back to this thing, which I love as well, luckily,
Mm,
because I just choose to teach things that I really love teaching, and that's what we do, which I think is what's really cool about this time in the yoga world, is that
mm,
there is so much information out there that you don't have to feel like you have to do or know it all.
mm,
You can focus on what's important to you. If you're really intrigued by fascia or women's health or
mm,
Parkinson's or MS, or, like if you have that, like when I first started teaching yoga in the 90s, like you had to be prepared to convince everyone why yoga can be helpful. And the
or
beauty of
even what it
nowadays,
is.
what it is, yeah, or
Step
that
1,
my
this is
parents,
what
that
yoga is.
it's not a cult.
Yeah.
My parents were always so worried that I joined a cult. But, nowadays people are more familiar with that. And so we have this great opportunity. Our job isn't necessarily to inform everyone about what yoga is and why that it's good for you or that it can be good for you, but to we can really focus on what we want to learn. And I think that brings us back to that authenticity, which to me is such a catchphrase now. It can land kind of flat because we use it so much.
Yeah.
But I think when you operate from that deep curiosity
Mm,
and you allow yourself to not have all the answers,
mm.
I think it opens up this beautiful unfolding and sustainability and intrigue and awe and so much more. But again, I have to make peace with the fact that
It's
that
never
it's
going to be
always
finished.
yeah,
So I
exactly.
guess that leads me to ask, and maybe you've answered this already, what where do you come up with all of the new ideas for your classes and your courses? Because there's something about the content in yoga medicine that never to me feels derivative. It always feels like there's a fresh perspective or a fresh take on it. So is that one of those rabbit holes is what inspires the new kind of course or the new class?
I think it's kind of what we've talked about. Like I don't force myself to practice. I practice because I want to and because I need to, because I know I'll feel better. You know,
Mm,
sometimes I may not want to initially, but I know that I will feel better. So I do it. And I find something that I'll enjoy because of that. But
mm.
it's a commitment to practicing and to learning. And, you know, that's not always in a yoga context. I take a lot of continuing ed. I went back and retook some grad school courses, which was fun this summer that were online. Um, uh, Attending medical conferences,
Mm.
sports medicine stuff. I mean, I'm just constantly I'm always making sure my rule was actually when I first started teaching was that I would do some kind of teacher training every year. And it didn't have to be like it wasn't like a full 200. It was just, you know, I'd go
Some
away
new
for
information.
a weekend or a week. I would drive
Mm,
up to Vancouver from Portland usually and go take some training. And so and I found that that once a year was such a good cadence and it kind of evolved. But I do, you know, nowadays I'm always looking before COVID to attend at least one or two conferences a year. Now I feel so blessed that I can do a bunch of them because they're
mm,
online.
It's really changed things for people like me who live in a more distant corner of the world. The sorts of things that we have
Mm.
access to now, the caliber and the quality of things that we have access to now without traveling, it's game changer.
Mhm. And
Mm.
then the hard part is, you know, if you're like me and you're curious, you're like our teachers and Rachel, you know, I'll
You
sign up
sign
for
up to
like
too
4.
many. Yeah.
And then I have to keep track of them, you
Mm,
know, and so finding a way and research too, you know, that's the other thing is people always ask me about keep up with research. I literally carve out a few hours of my week where I sit and just comb through research and I get through what I get through. I mean, it's like an unending rabbit hole. You can spend your whole week digging through research just on one tiny subject and barely hit the tip of the iceberg. But trying to keep up with, I get a bunch of emails with updates and stuff like that too. And then at the end of the week, usually it's in my Friday afternoons, I'll go over, you know, I'll carve out 2 or 3 hours where I'll sit and just dig through research. And it never
oh,
feels like
our
enough,
Friday
but I
afternoons are very different then. No way in hell.
it still doesn't feel like enough, but I have to close the book. Like I have
Mm,
an end point on it. And
yeah.
sometimes I'll blur that line a little bit, but usually I'm like, okay, that's it.
Mm,
You know, because you can keep going. And then there's this weird, insatiable desire to keep learning. And as
mm.
teachers, like to feel like we have to keep staying inspired, which is the flip side of the practice too, is like I
Yeah.
I really try and step back when I feel that happening, like this, Tiffany, you've got to keep up and you've got to do this one and this one and this
You've got to do
one.
something different. You've got to pull out something amazing. That's so
Oh,
much pressure.
and it's the worst as far as like inspiration and creativity. And
Yeah.
so that's
That
when I have
pressure
to
really
step.
closes off.
That's usually my guide point to like step back, do
Yeah.
less,
Yeah.
more
It's sort of
meditation
it's
time.
like all long-term things, isn't it? I'm thinking about my relationship with my partner here. We've been together for more than 30 years. And I think all long-term relationships have these
Mm,
cycles where, the passion and the inspiration are really high, and cycles where they're low. And I think you need to sort of stockpile some of the excitement and inspiration from that uptick of the cycle, and be a little bit more disciplined about bringing them back in the low point in the cycle. So even when
yeah.
you're describing signing up for 4 courses, that initial excitement at some point fades, and you're looking at all the course notes going, ugh, I have to, oh, I've got to sit down and study. So kind of trying to spread the inspiration out of, I'm just going to do an hour this week
Mhm.
and then I'll see what happens. And often when you put in that little bit of discipline, the inspiration comes back. Not always, but often it does. And you're like, oh, this little thing, this little nugget is really interesting.
Totally, and I think if you're anything like me, if you put it in if I put it in my iPhone, like I
Yeah.
schedule it, it's pretty much as good as done.
Yeah.
So, if I have a course, I'll schedule like an hour
Yeah, totally.
here and there
And
to make
sometimes life
sure.
intervenes, but 80% of the time, 90% of the
And
time.
I just move it. So, if I do that, I'll just move it, just go and you edit. At
Mm,
least you still have that hour being held somewhere, right?
yeah.
At
For
least
me,
that's
often it'll have
me.
to be next week. If I've missed the window this week, that's it. The rest of the week is full. It's going to be
Sometimes.
next week. But most of the time you still get there. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's not the thing every single time. It's consistency over time, which might only
Yeah.
be that 80 to 90%, but it gets you there.
And that's the thing that we were kind of alluding to before is like it can't become a chore.
Mm-mm.
That's when I'm like, "Oh, okay, Tiffany, you're cut off. Step back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Step away from the computer, step away from the online courses. Like you need to back off." So like when it starts feeling like that chore,
Mm,
we need to reconsider, I think, where we're putting our time because ultimately
mm.
we are all human with a finite amount of time on this earth and a
Yeah.
finite amount of time every day and every week. And how we spend our time is precious,
Mm.
and I think looking at, what is important to you and how does how do the things that I fill my schedule with reflect that? Because it's so easy to go through
100%.
those weeks and just be like week by week by week, they're just passing by, flying by, and what we're doing doesn't really reflect what's important to us.
Yeah, and I think that's where the sustainability, if we're doing things that are meaningful to us, if we're doing things that sort of fit with our values, they sort of feed themselves, maybe cyclically. I'm not always on an uptick in excitement and motivation, but when I'm doing things that are aligned with my values, I'll always cycle back towards motivation and
Mhm.
inspiration if I just keep going, as opposed to when you're sort of forcing yourself to do something that isn't true to you, that
The thing
doesn't
that,
feed
like, you're
itself.
supposed to do, that, like, your family
Exactly.
wants you to do, or, like, you think is the right thing because,
Yeah.
that's the time in your life. Yeah, totally. And, yeah, I just I really believe that curiosity is such it's kind of like that foundation of it. And then, for me, I'm constantly taking notes too. We were laughing about this the other day when we
Hmm.
were chatting. It's like I remember too, I've done this forever. When I first started teaching, I would write down notes and I had like and finally I got to making journals with them. And I threw a bunch of them away not too long ago, but I kept a few. But I had like all these journals full of classes, and a lot of them were dated. And like,
Oh.
even, and then when I started teaching at Yoga Glow, I have all of those in there. And then at some point, I switched over to computer. So
Mm.
ever since like, I want to say 2014 or so, I switched over and now it's all in my computer. So none of those are gone. Every class I've taught on Yoga Glow, I have the framework. I mean, I might not have the
Yeah.
details, but
Yeah.
I
The
have the
Tiffany
framework
shorthand.
and the kind of the nut and bolts of it, the important
Mm.
parts of it, because we know that there's um, a lot of details within the practice. And you're not going to write all of that out, but there's
Yeah.
there's that underlying nugget, that underlying purpose that's there, and really I think is the important part of staying clear to that and not getting lost in all of the details of the
Yeah.
teaching. So I can't tell you how many pages, even right now, just pages. I have like a next ideas document which I think
No,
has 30
totally.
pages in it of
I
just like
have the same.
bullets.
Mine are handwritten though. That's the thing for me is if I'm kind of gathering inspiration, typed notes just don't do it for me. I don't know. There's something about the process of brain
Mm.
to hand for me of writing. So all of my upcoming ideas are handwritten almost illegibly. But when I have that time where I'm low in motivation or low in inspiration, and I know I've got to plan a class and I've got nothing that's really firing me up in the moment, that's when I pull out
Yeah.
all of those almost illegible scraps and sort of harness some of last week's excitement or last week's curiosity.
See, but the thing that you can't do with paper is I can, so I'll like copy paste and pull it into December's teachings, and then it's out of there so I can see what hasn't been used yet.
Or I just draw lines through and I
Look at you. Yeah.
old
So
school, new school.
I have my documents on my computer. I also have like the notes in your phone. So I have separate ones.
Totally.
When I'm going to make a class, I'll look through both and see
Mm,
what's really resonating with me in the moment. Because, you might write down, sometimes I'll write down whole class ideas, and then go back to it and be like, it's not really, it's not feeling relevant to me right now for whatever
yeah.
reason. And it's not that it might not still be a great class. It's just, you know, that purpose behind it. We all know that just a list of poses is kind of flat, and you
Yeah.
could almost teach any class
Yeah.
with the same
That's
set
what
of
I find.
poses.
I'll cycle back to that class plan and go, oh, I'm not very interested in that theme anymore. But that sequence actually fits really well with something that just popped into my head yesterday when I was listening to a podcast or when I was doing somebody else's class. I'm going to grab that sequence and repurpose it with a slightly
Mm.
different focus. And that always feels like it leads you down juicy little pathways, doesn't it? Sometimes you just
Mhm.
need the spark to get you started, and then the rest takes care of itself.
Or like, I think the other side of it too is if you take a well-balanced class, and especially if you're teaching more of a philosophical focus, in your class, you could really teach that. It could be that same class every time because I want to have some simplicity in the postures to leave the space for the nuggets, so that I'm
Mm,
not. I think it's beautiful. I love a really well architected class and having the alignment details and anatomical details, maybe, and having really specific or subtle cues, but all of those details are also can some in some ways be a distraction, especially if I'm teaching more of a philosophical class where the
mm.
focus is on something else entirely, whatever that might be. I think someone just commented on one I had recently, which was on cultivating purpose. And so when you have more of those philosophical themes, it could almost be any class. What you need is the space to plant those little seeds and
You're basically saying that time and energy and attention are currency, whether that's for you as a teacher or
mm,
whether that's from the perspective of the student. And you don't want to spend the energy and attention on a really interesting sequence if you want them to be thinking about qualities or principles or philosophical ideas. You want to save space for that.
and like we said before, the coming full circle is like there's beauty in that simplicity.
Hmm.
We tend to, as yoga teachers, start to get all excited about inspiration and creativity and sequencing, but there's something really powerful in the simple. Like I remember, and you probably remember this too, like going to a yoga class back in the 90s was so different, but
Mm,
it was potent, because
mm,
it was simple,
mm,
and we still have classes like that today. You can still take those styles of classes, but there was something beautiful in that simplicity of it just being a few poses and some breath and that depth and clarity that comes from that simplicity, which is
mm,
so profound, and the space that it creates, which is so important. I think for me, what's important is just having some sort of purpose, whatever it is. I think that's kind of consistent with all of our yoga medicine teachers, whether that's looking at the fascia or the thoracic spine or looking at purpose or the breath or our physiology. There's so many different things to do, but or just a well-rounded sequence to just be.
basically the why. And that really does bring us full circle, doesn't it? Like what keeps you coming back to your mat to practice? It's the why. What do I really need from today? What keeps you inspired as a teacher? It's the same thing. It's the why. What do I want to express or communicate, or what do I want to facilitate for my students? And really, when all of the bells and whistles fall away, that deep sense of purpose is what keeps any long-term endeavor heading in the right track,
Mm,
whether that's, my relationship with my partner, or any really long-term practice. If you don't have that deep-seated why that drives you, no amount of motivation is going to carry you through over the long term.
absolutely. And I think the other interesting thing is that like any profession, you can get burnt out. And
Mm,
so what's interesting about it is that, we come back to the self-care, right? When we start to feel burnt out, maybe we'll do a whole episode on burnout at some point, but it's a
100%.
it's a longer story, but when we're tiptoeing toward that kind of burnout phase, self-care is so important. And then as yoga teachers, when you're really burnt out, you're kind of like, I want to pull away from yoga, right? I need to do something else. For me, I have to think about it because I've definitely tiptoed into that myself. I know every time I write a new course, I feel like I've like just given birth to it. My COVID baby was the functional anatomy course. That was
Mm,
well, I have stepkids. I got to inherit mine, so I don't know about. I'm sure it's a lot more than that, but it's my version of going through labor, and and so many other things in what we've created with yoga medicine. And so I know this well firsthand that, you have to leave room for that self-care. And the catch is that the tools for self-care are the practices. And, when we're burnt out from teaching, it can be
mm,
challenging. And so sometimes I like to pose it as a kind of a challenge to myself of like, okay, this is where I'll write up something, you know, maybe thinking of myself in third person, or like I might write it up for someone else, writing up a plan and coming up with it. And then a lot of times, my teachings online, yoga medicine, online, yoga medicine online, are a reflection of my practices and what I need. And of course, I'm thinking about other people and we have requests and there's a lot of other things, but it is all framed around what do I think is meaningful, which isn't the same
yeah,
for everyone. There's not I don't believe that yoga medicine online is like the platform for every person in the world. Uh,
that's where we differ.
I think it's for people who really appreciate the therapeutics and the
Yeah,
nuances and our style. And so and I hope that it's helpful for people. And all I can do is what I find interesting, what I found helpful in my own body, working with patients and students, and share that. And so my classes definitely reflect that. And a lot of times when I'm feeling burnout, it's that challenge of like, okay, I need to create a protocol for myself and I get to test it out. I mean, I think,
what would I give me if I was somebody else?
yeah. And,
Mm,
with my herniated disc, it was similar at first. I kind of liked to pretend like it wasn't there. But at some point, I did get to experiment and try out all that stuff, and that's how I got so great at working with people with back issues, whether they had disc
mm,
herniations or not. I know I believe that a lot of people with back issues are probably drawn to my classes online because a lot of those nuances are already always in there.
mm.
Um, just because it's kind of in my DNA, and it's luckily for me, it's kind of like the most common thing that people go through, the most common reason to go to the doctor or seek out yoga. So, it is a common shared experience as humans. Yeah.
Well, I mean, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, I think when it comes to jobs like teaching yoga, where for a lot of us, it's more than just a job, there's some aspect of feeling kind of called to do it or doing it as an active service. It almost feels like if you had a regular job, you wouldn't expect to be excited to go to work every Monday morning and you'd be quite happy to get to Friday afternoon. And there's this feeling, I think, amongst yoga teachers that it shouldn't be that way with yoga, that it should always
Mm,
be like, oh my God, I get to teach today. But of course, like anything that we do,
mhm.
no matter how much I love my day during, I don't always get up in the morning, and leap out of bed and woohoo, today I get to teach. Often I'd like a day off, or it's a nice day. I'd rather be outside. I'm always happy when I'm doing it, but I think there's this
Yeah.
expectation that it should always feel like, the angels are singing, and that's just not realistic. It's still a job, and so there'll still be days where I'd rather be hiking. I've just had a lot of jobs where I definitely don't feel as good while I'm doing it as I do teaching. So I'm always reminded, hey, it's better than cleaning nightclub toilets on a weekend morning. Even even the worst day of yoga teaching is way better than the best day of most of the jobs I've had.
I agree. Well
Mm.
said, and I think a really good reminder too. I know, um, there was a long time actually where I was teaching yoga through school where I said I would never teach yoga as my main form of income,
Yeah, I
which
felt the
is
same when I did teacher training. I was like, I know I want to teach, but I won't do it full time because that will rob all the joy and excitement and beauty from it. And for
yeah.
some people, I'm sure that is true,
And
but for
so
me, teaching was so much better than the alternatives.
yeah. And so when I started my sports medicine practice, for me, at least it was nice because it gave me some of that, cushion at least, and I would just pour all of my extra income into um, yoga medicine because I loved it and creating what we loved.
Mm,
But it also made it not feel like this thing that had to be done. And I
mm,
often encourage people who are looking to start teaching, like to not rush into it because
yeah.
it's a lot. I've seen this a lot in the 200 hours, people who like jump ship because, they have this job that they hate and they want to become a yoga teacher because it looks so wonderful. And it's like, well, let's hold on here
Yeah.
because there is still a job and there's a lot of work to be done and it takes
Mm,
time and there's a lot of people teaching and so you've kind of build up to it and I love for me that was a great transition to be able to kind of build it and do it as something I really loved and
mm,
it kind of turning into now I don't see patients much. I don't see them much at all. So, when I'm in town, I might see them once a week or once a month.
mm.
And right now during COVID, I've actually taken a little break, which is good because pulled so much online. I don't know how I would have done it
Mm.
if everything else hadn't stood still. So, um, yeah, I do think it can be challenging because it is a job, and we need to be realistic about it. That doesn't mean that
Yeah.
it should be a chore, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always this perfect sunny day, like it
Yeah.
might
And
look
there
like
are aspects
online.
of every job that are still, they're
Mm,
just the things that have to be done. They're the kind of, admin, hygiene, all of those little things that are just part and parcel and aren't necessarily the why, but come along with it.
yeah.
Yeah. I, it took me a couple of years from teacher training, knowing that I wanted to teach, but being very, very nervous of doing it full time. It took me a couple of years to kind of figure out what it actually felt like to teach and to imagine what it would be like to shift from, 5 classes a week to 20 classes a week. And I'm still really glad that I did it and that I did end up teaching full time. But I agree. I think it's not something that you want to rush into, especially if your expectation is it's going to be so much better than my bad job and every day will be amazing because, every
Mm,
day isn't amazing, of course. And there are still days when you wake up and you're not excited to go, but remembering why you do it. And for
mhm.
me, why it's better than what I've done before really helps me keep it in perspective.
Yeah.
Mm,
I think, when I first started teaching, and maybe this was similar for you too, but, back in the 90s, it was like becoming a yoga teacher was kind of like giving up any attachment to money or fame or, any of those things.
I
And
think there's still an undercurrent of that even now that we should be
yeah.
somehow just living on prana,
I that sounds wonderful.
doesn't
I'll take
it?
that course whenever you're ready. But but I think, you know, when we go into it with this idea of it being a livelihood or being a way to, make a name for ourselves or something, it has a really different feeling to it. And not
Mm,
to say that that's wrong, because I do believe that in order to be good at what you're doing, you do need to make it sustainable at some point. Now that may take a while. I mean, you and I think both know that creating um, a career in anything takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It takes a lot of, just dedication. And it doesn't come easily, just like any job. You start
Mm,
from the ground and work up. But if the curiosity is there and the commitment is there and you love
mm,
it, in the end, the way that it influences you, stress is a perception. Stress is our perception of things. And so it's not necessarily about how much we're doing. I remember back when I was at Nike, I would see 60 plus patients a week, which is a lot for an acupuncturist. And on the weekends, I would travel and teach workshops. And a few times a year, I'd go away for a whole week and teach a teacher training. And but I loved it because, I'd be seeing patients all day and I love that, but that's also exhausting
mm.
in its own way. And then it just felt like such a nice shift to be able to go and do the two things that I loved. But, obviously you can only do that for so long too. But
I think you're kind of making me think about how my teaching the mixture of things that I teach has changed over time. And kind of year on year, I've been tweaking the balance to make it sort of fit me more. So I think another big part of it is in your career, whether that's teaching yoga or any career really, figuring out what aspects of it kind of feed you and fill your cup and drive you and have that sustainability feeling to them, and which are depleting. And I know my
Mm,
partner does this too, and he's an electrician. So I know it's not just from the perspective of being a yoga teacher, but for me, teaching certain kind of classes, for me, that was a really vigorous, fast paced practice. While it was fun in the moment and I think I was good at it, depleted my energy. It took so much to kind of work me up to go. And afterwards, I'd be absolutely exhausted. Whereas slower paced or more thoughtful classes take less from me as a teacher, working with people one on one and seeing them really excited about being able to stand on one leg to put their shoes on or their pants on. That really feeds me and fills me up and gives me the energy for the next part of whatever my day is. So I think that
mm,
level of bringing mindfulness into your work as well and figuring out, like we do in our practice, what's feeding me and fulfilling me and what's depleting and emptying me. How much is enough? How much is too much? And applying
mhm,
that to our jobs as well can really make it feel like it's something that you could do for the rest of your life and not, I can only get through till Friday afternoon and then I need a rest. Does that make
mhm,
sense?
mhm.
Yeah.
I think of this as kind of like reinventing yourself. And
Mm,
I think for me, I do this all the time, both with myself and yoga medicine, is, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed, is to be able to just sit down and clear out all the noise and, take away all of the stuff that you feel like you have to do
mm,
and think about like what is it that I'm really wanting to do and create here? Like you have the opportunity to start over anytime. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're starting over from scratch, but, like myself with my injury, it was kind of what instigated the shift into yoga medicine from Tiffany yoga and from, my teachings back then to being more focused on what was meaningful to me, what
mm,
really does bring me depth and meaning in my life.
mhm.
I enjoy doing. And that might not be for someone else. So, I mean, some people really love creating creative sequences and that really feeds them and they're good at that. And
Mm.
um, I think everyone's different, and so being
You
able
said
to
stress is perception. So stress is in the eye of the beholder, but fulfillment and joy are too, aren't they? There's real
mm,
individuality to that.
mhm, and I think being able to kind of clear the slate of
Mm,
the demands, because like, we kinda pigeonhole ourselves sometimes. To be able to clear the slate and reimagine yourself if you were to start afresh, like, what would you wanna be doing? What are the things
mm,
like, we kinda started out talking about, like, where am I spending my time? Like, what's important to me? Is
yeah.
creative sequencing important to me? And you know what? Your students might be really upset if you've been doing that for a long time and you stop doing it, but eventually you'll start to shift. Like, I know I was thinking about this the other day. I used to love making playlists. And I used to teach these really fun, creative, sweaty vinyasa classes back when I lived in Portland. And I loved it at the time. Um, and it had physicality, and we'd focus on things, physical things like the hips or this or that. We'd focus on things that brought a little bit more depth to it that I really loved. But it was, that was my thing. That was what I loved. And it's changed, since then. Obviously, at some point I had to sit down and be like, okay, what's meaningful to me now? Is that
Mm,
meaningful to me? At some point it became such a burden to create a new playlist every time.
yeah.
And now I don't really ever use music unless there's, street noise or something. I'll put on some kind of gray music or
Mm,
background noise.
background.
Yeah, gray music.
So you said at the beginning, your body and your mind have changed over time. And so your practice have changed over time. It's exactly the same thing with teaching or with any career or really with any long term relationship, isn't it? It's never going to be static. That's not the
Mm,
nature of life. Life always changes. And so as our wants and needs and drives and motivations and interests changes, curiosity leads us in different directions. Our teaching should change as well, and not
mm,
just the content of a specific class, but even the mixture of classes. And I think when I started teaching, there was this very straight progression. You would teach, and then you would teach full time, and then you would run workshops, and then you would run retreats, and then you would run trainings, and then you'd own a studio, and that was the progression. And I think these days that's 100% not true, even if it was true at the time. There's so many different ways to make a living in the yoga world that it's only natural that
mm,
the mixture of things we do could change over time as our interests do, and as we get to know ourselves better, and as we follow those rabbit holes of curiosity.
mhm. You can always reinvent yourself,
Yeah, and it doesn't
but
even have to be a massive change. It can be a little tweak.
and that can be that can be between careers, that can be within a career,
Mhm.
but you can't replace the curiosity.
Mm,
And I think that kind of brings us back around to the beginning. Like, it's got to be there.
yeah.
And there's a lot of little tricks and things, like me taking notes all the time, like we were talking about, to come back to for inspiration when you're, about to plan a class or something, to help inspire you, taking courses and scheduling it. There's all of these things, but I think it all stems from that curiosity. And when it comes from that place, I think it feeds you on a different level. Um, that doesn't have this incessant drain too, right? The inspiration where you're constantly feeling like you have to keep up. And so,
External pressure.
yeah, embracing the mystery, allowing yourself to be in progress
Mm,
too as you continue to learn, um, and knowing that you're enough, like as you are. I think as yoga teachers, we kind of have this feeling of like waiting to learn enough to be really great at our job. Or, I
one
mean,
day will be fully formed.
yeah, and even I have those insecurities. I'm like, am I ready yet to teach this content, or
Mm,
am I feeling it today? Like we all have these insecurities within us and these questions. And I really believe that, um I think that's what makes us great at what we do. I think if you're curious enough, you should be questioning yourself. And yeah, I think it's a healthy place to be. So,
because there's no end point, is there? There's not going to be a day where either of us are fully formed and complete and perfect. We're always works in progress. That's the end point.
mm,
The journey is the destination. And so if we expect the same thing in our teaching and in our practice, that there's no end goal, it's not going anywhere. It is the thing. The process is the finished product. I think if we give ourselves that space in our practice and in our careers and in our relationships, it just opens up a bit more space for things to be as they are, with the awareness that they're always going to change. Nothing's really permanent.
well said.
Oh, we went deep, didn't we?
Ah,
Well,
with
hopefully that's
that,
pulled out some interesting, yeah, maybe that's a really natural place to wrap up.
yeah, and with that, now you can head to your mat.
Or maybe head outside.
Exactly. What's next?
Well, what is
Well,
next for you? What are you up to for the rest of your day, evening, afternoon?
back to the computer, I think for me, a little bit more work to do. Um, More podcasts coming, of course,
Woohoo!
in the works. Yeah, what about you?
It'll be dog walking for me with a podcast in ear, and then work, and then practice
Work.
later.
See how we say it? See, it is, I mean, it's work.
It's work.
Gotta love it for what it is. I'll be doing more like email and stuff like that today, which isn't my favorite part, but I'd rather be
I
like
feel like there are some days where I don't mind
creating.
doing the sort of admin side, but
Yeah,
usually I'd rather be teaching.
yeah, I
More
agree.
fun.
Oh,
Well,
this is
thank you
great.
so much for sharing your experiences and your insights. I think there have been some really interesting little nuggets in there for people, but just the bigger conversation, I think that sort of spaciousness about following your curiosity and being led by your interests and your passions and creating space for things to change. Hopefully that itself will kind of give people a bit more room to just enjoy themselves and enjoy the journey.
Embodying you.
Hmm.
Yes, I love it.
Thank you very much, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me. It was nice. I look forward to our next chat.
Maybe burnout next time. Mm. Thank you. See you.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.